In case you couldn't tell from my last few videos, I'm pretty excited for Breath of the Wild 2. I can't stop coming up with ideas for what could happen in the sequel, but if you know me, I have a bit of a soft spot for the monsters in the series. So naturally, when we got to see a Talus with bokoblins riding around on its back, that had me thrilled. Remixed enemies have been near the top of my wishlist for the sequel, and now that we know that we're getting at least one, I want to throw out some ideas for other Overworld bosses that we could see in the sequel. 2 bosses from old games, 2 Breath of the Wild bosses remixed, and 1 enemy who's never been a full boss before, but would fit very nicely in a new area shown to be in the sequel. Let's get right to it. So before we really get moving, here's what each boss would be, ideally. Each boss in question would be an Overworld boss in the sequel, like Talus's, Hinox's, and Molduga were in Breath of the Wild. Like those enemies, each new boss would have multiple copies, though I think some would be limited to only certain areas of the map, like Molduga were exclusive to Gerudo Desert. These creatures could be typically placed to guard treasure chests, which would provide some reward like an inventory expansion or equipment. Besides that though, I'll just tell you about each boss as we go. Let's begin with some old bosses who would be new to this world, shall we? So the first enemy I would like to see come back is Gohma, a boss from a few older Zelda games. This enemy hasn't seen the light of day for a long time, and I think the sequel should keep it that way, making Gohma an enemy only found in caves or underground. Incidentally, Queen Gohma was the parasite responsible for killing off the Great Deku Tree in Ocarina of Time. The new game seems to be missing the new Deku Tree we knew from Breath of the Wild, so perhaps there's a Gohma connection here as well. Ganondorf is back after all, and I imagine he'll have a hand in any new and improved monsters, just like he did so long ago. Gohma has had a few different attack styles over the years. The original version of Gohma simply walked side to side, frequently shooting blasts at Link. Gohma usually depends on moving around with its eye closed, only exposing it occasionally when attacking. The only way to kill these Gohmas is with an arrow to the eye. Ocarina of Time's Queen Gohma worked a lot differently, using melee attacks and dropping hatchlings around her to fight with her. I think a combination of these two styles would work really well, much like how Armo Gohma in Twilight Princess fought with both lasers and hatchlings. Plus, the crawling up walls would make for some incredible battles in tunnels and caves, where Breath of the Wild 2's Gohmas would hopefully appear. And, of course, these new Gohmas would be weak to arrows in the eye, though like with Hinox enemies, they would still take damage from other attacks as well. I imagine Gohmas in the sequel would look a lot like they did in Hyrule Warriors, big, armored spider crab monsters. They probably wouldn't be too tough, being comparable to a Lionel in health, with red, blue, and black variants that increase as they go. The higher levels might gain a new attack or two as well, like a scatter shot or a sweeping laser. When defeated, it would be fitting for these bosses to drop guts, like most bosses, with a much rarer Gohma material being a Gohma eye. Beyond that, I think that paints a pretty clear picture of a Gohma in Breath of the Wild 2. Now, here's a boss that's been around since the original Legend of Zelda, but has never made it into a 3D game, at least in the main series. Manhandla is a massive plant-based creature with 4 heads, which, despite being a plant, often moves around rather quickly. This boss made an appearance in Hyrule Warriors, which I think did an incredible job reimagining this classic enemy, so if it makes a comeback, I'd like to see a similar design. I think for Breath of the Wild 2, it would serve as a good boss in the Faron region, where thick foliage covers the majority of the forest. With Gohmas living in caves and Manhandlas living in the Faron area, this would help make the land of Hyrule a little more interesting to explore, since we've seen this iteration once before. Now for how the boss would work, while Manhandla has been seen moving around quickly in some games, I think for this new appearance it ought to take the stationary route. Such a large creature among the trees in Faron would have a hard time moving around unless it just bulldozed over the trees, which would be pretty cool, I suppose. Instead though, it could wait silently before springing out when Link draws near, trying to grab him in one of its 4 fanged mouths. Should Link survive the sneak attack, then Manhandla could resort to ranged attacks, spraying acidic projectiles from afar, only lashing out if Link drew near. The heads of Manhandla would remain the creature's weak point, though setting Manhandla on fire would immediately set it into a panic until it could douse the flames. Size-wise, I think a Manhandla would be about as big as they were in Hyrule Warriors, like with Gohma. Combined with the Sneak Strike and only appearing in Faerun, I think these creatures would add nicely to the jungle theme of the area. When defeated, Manhandla might drop some equipment that they presumably took off the hands of other travelers, which would burst out from the central pod. They also would probably drop some guts and stuff for armor upgrades and elixir crafting. That said, I think that covers the 2 retro boss ideas, so now let's move on to the remixed Breath of the Wild bosses, shall we? Now, this one isn't really all that original, since it pretty much just reaches back to the origins of the Hinox. However, I always felt like these bosses were too weak and slow in Breath of the Wild. If Hinoxes kept the pressure on by constantly tossing explosives, I think I'd change my mind pretty quickly about these guys. Technically, Black Hinoxes and Stalnoxes were able to throw bomb barrels in Breath of the Wild, but this was such a rare occurrence that I usually never saw the attack before I saw a pile of Hinox toenails. The bombs being tossed wouldn't make as big of an explosion as typical bomb barrels, but they would still certainly pose a challenge. I imagine them being a bit more dangerous than the Sheikah Slate rune bombs, dealing enough damage to insta-kill a newly awakened Link, but not quite deadly later on in the game. Bomb Hinoxes would have to open their eyes when throwing a bomb, so if you were to shoot said eye while they had a bomb in hand, they would drop the explosive, harming itself and probably stunning it for a moment. Of course, if you didn't hit the eye, you'd have other problems to worry about. Also, it would be neat if Hinoxes occasionally grabbed Link and tossed him, like in Link's Awakening. I think Bomb Hinoxes would make a good replacement for any generic Hinoxes already found on the world map in Breath of the Wild, with the exception of Stalnoxes, since they're already pretty different. Their item drops would be the same too, though they could also drop some of their bombs for Link to collect, since we don't seem to have the Sheikah Slate this time around. Bombs as an item would be fun to have back in my opinion, and this would provide a natural way to regain them without having bomb flowers everywhere. Now, on to the other remixed boss. Since Taluses already seem to be getting remixed for the sequel, the only other overworld boss to rework is the Molduga. Thankfully, I've had an idea for these guys for a while based on how they swim through the sand. Drop them in the water. That, and maybe stick an anglerfish light on them or something to make them feel more aquatic. These massive creatures move through the sand like giant fish, so if we end up venturing deeper in Hyrule's waters in the sequel, I want to have something cool to fight. These new Molduga would probably attack somewhat similarly to how they do on land. When Link gets close enough, they notice him, rushing straight in his direction. If Link can't move quickly enough right before they bite down, well, Davy Jones' locker might be getting a new visitor. For a bonus, perhaps these creatures could rip off a move from Majora's Mask's Gyorg, creating a vortex leading straight to the monster's mouth. I'm not sure what gear Link would have to fight back, but I imagine either a hookshot or underwater explosive could stun the Molduga long enough to close in and attack with a sword. As previously implied, these creatures would only show up in large bodies of water, a couple off Hyrule's east coast, and maybe one in Lake Hylia, just for good measure. Like their desert counterparts, these creatures could drop some chests with gear in them, though these could hold Zora or fishing-themed gear rather than Gerudo. The guts and such would also be largely the same, so you don't have to worry about 2 types of Molduga fin in your inventory. Finally, let's get to the enemy that hasn't been a boss before, but I think would make a good one for the sequel. Longtime viewers, Twilight Princess fans, and Triforce Heroes enthusiasts alike might recognize the Aeralfos, the reptilian master of the air. These creatures have been seen in the City in the Sky, Hyrule Castle, and the Sky Realm of the Drablands, 2 of which are very high up places. As it happens, the new trailer gave us a look at another high up place, the Sky Islands over Hyrule. So what better way to bring back these enemies than as overworld bosses in the sequel? Fighting these guys in Twilight Princess was amazing, and I think they would make sense to be very similar in this new game. Aeralfos fly around constantly, staying well above Link and guarding any attacks with their shield. When they want to strike, they hold up their shield and swoop down at Link head first, and then strike with a sword. In Breath of the Wild 2, if we get a hook shot, claw shot, grip shot, or magna shot, that would obviously be a good way to either pull in the Aeralfos or steal away its shield. If we don't get such an item though, I think parrying would be the key to fighting an Aeralfos. Simply wait until they swoop down, parry their intended blow, and then strike back with a weapon of your own. As for placement, well, it's a little difficult to say how well they'd fit in the Sky Islands, but I think there's more than likely going to be some good spots for enemies up there and bosses among them. Upon death, an Aeralfos would simply have to drop its sword and shield. I mean, who doesn't want to go around with a giant target on their shield? They could also drop Aeralfos wings, which might be handy in upgrading clothes like that new outfit Link has. And that's about it for my ideas on Overworld bosses for Breath of the Wild 2. What do you think of these boss ideas? Are there any other bosses you'd like to see in the sequel? Be sure to let me know in the comments before you go watch another Breath of the Wild 2 video. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time you're in the Legend Zone.